Hello everyone, this is Here's Trivia, and welcome back to our unit guide series for Total War Pharaoh as we continue today with the Lower Egyptian native units. If you missed our previous guide on the Upper Egyptian native units, then I would highly recommend checking that one out first, using the link above as there are many parallels between the Lower and Upper Egyptian units. But of course, feel free to finish this video first before using the playlist link down below in the description to check out all the Total War Pharaoh unit guides here on the channel. Now, native units in Total War Pharaoh are bound to given areas on the campaign map called realms. In the case of Lower Egypt, we have 11 units that are only recruitable in the 10 provinces located here. Breaking them down into recruitment tiers, we have the Lower Egyptian Militia, the Lower Egyptian Spearmen Militia, and the Lower Egyptian Militia Slingers in Tier 1, which means they can be recruited as long as you own a Tier 1 settlement in any of the 10 provinces within Lower Egypt. Then in Tier 2, we have the Lower Egyptian Axe Conscript, the Lower Egyptian Swordsmen Conscript, and the Lower Egyptian Archers. And to recruit these, you need to have a Tier 2 native recruitment building constructed, which is the first level of this building chain. Then if you upgrade this building chain to Tier 3, you will gain access to the Lower Egyptian Veteran Spearmen, the Lower Egyptian Veteran Swordsmen, and the armored Lower Egyptian Archers, as well as the Lower Egyptian Light Chariots. And finally, upgrading the building one final time to Tier 4, you get to unlock the Lower Egyptian Chariot. So now that we know how to recruit all these units, let's dive into their individual stats, starting with the Lower Egyptian Militia. As your typical bottom tier club and shield infantry, the Lower Egyptian Militia draws many similarities to other Tier 1 club units, but there are some major differences that are unique to the Lower Egyptian units, in that most of them will have a higher than normal unit count. As you can see here, instead of the standard 120 unit count, we have 160 for the Lower Egyptian Militia. This is a massive 33% increase, and the health is also increased to 20,800, which allows the per unit health to remain the same at 130. The armor is low at 30 points with 15 from shield, but that is reflective of this unit's low tier and desert specialization. The armor quality is average, and the range block chance on the shield is just 25%. Now, to counterbalance the massive bonus of having 33% more manpower, the Lower Egyptian units will suffer from lower morale, as the Lower Egyptian Militia here just has 36 points of morale. They also have lower than average melee attack and defense, with 17 and 19 here, and 5 points of that defense is coming from their tiny little shield. Their speed is decent at 43, and their damage matched the other club units, with all 23 coming from their armor piercing side. They also have a low charge bonus of just 14. Additionally, from their traits, while the Lower Egyptian units are lightly armored and thus resistant to heat, they do not have the resilience to desert attrition, which the Upper Egyptian native units have. They do have the ability to hide in scrubs and forests and are expendable, meaning they will not negatively affect nearby ally units' morale should they rout, assuming that the neighboring ally unit are not expendable themselves. But most importantly, they have a trait called Weak Vigor, which makes them fatigued more easily. This is extremely bad, as being fatigued will penalize all major combat stats such as morale, melee attack, and defense. Then finally, as a club user, they get Armor Breaker, which allows them to break enemy armors twice as fast. In terms of stances, they only have Hold, which keeps them organized while holding a position. At the end of the day, the Lower Egyptian Militia has much lower stats across the board than other similar units from other native unit rosters, because their strength simply lies in sheer numbers. However, that strength in numbers is not worth it in my opinion because of their innate lower morale, combat stats, and most importantly, the weak vigor trait, which only farther lowers key stats such as morale, melee attack, and defense. So even though we have 33% extra units, we're not going to fully enjoy those advantages because you'll hit your opponents less, get hit more, and rout earlier due to lower morale. Then moving on, we have the Lower Egyptian Spearmen Militia, which is pretty much the same unit, except they use a spear instead of a club. This makes their damage weaker, with 23 base damage and 4 armor piercing, but they do get 16 bonus against large. Charge bonus is also weaker at only 6 points, and their melee attack is 1 point higher, and melee defense is 4 points higher. On top of that, they also now carry a 3 ammo 50 range projectile that deals 10 base damage and 1 armor piercing damage. Strangely, I think this missile weapon is a mistake as they lack the fire while moving trait and there is no accuracy stats listed for this projectile in game. So I think this is probably a copy and paste job that went wrong, and I don't think any of the lower Egyptian units should have this projectile. But here they do, so enjoy it until it gets patched. But it's not really any damage because it's only 10 base and 1 armor piercing with accuracy that I assume is no higher than 8. And overall, I don't recommend recruiting these units either. Finally, for the final tier 1 unit, we have the lower Egyptian Militia Slingers, which also has a larger unit count of 120 compared to the standard 90 for range infantry. Health per unit stays normal at 100 for a total health of 12,000, and the rest of the stats are all low. As you'll find the Slinger unit with just 10 armor of average quality, morale of 31 points, speed of 42, melee attack and defense of just 9 and 6. The only positive thing you can say about them is that they have a decent melee weapon in the club and it deals 23 armor piercing damage, but with only 9 melee attack, we're really going to be using that hit chance floor of 15%, and that's the only bit of damage we can do to destroy armor as they will have the armor breaking ability. Finally, the charge bonus is average at 11. For range stats, we have 32 ammo at 210 range, which is pretty standard for slingers. Damage is 15 base and 2 armor piercing, while accuracy is a bit low at 8 and reload time is okay at 6.3 seconds. Now, technically for range units, having a 33% larger unit count is much stronger than melee units with a 33% larger unit count, since you can ignore all the poor melee stat like melee attack and melee defense. The only range stat that really matters is the damage and accuracy. And in this case, we do suffer from a little bit lower accuracy, but just 1 point versus the 33% increase in units, which means 33% additional shots per volley, means you'll have a 33% increase in damage. However, slinger units in general suffer from low damage anyways. So even if you get 33% increased damage, it doesn't really make these units recruitable either. Now, moving on to tier 2 units, we start with the lower Egyptian Axe Conscripts, which once again has 160 unit counts with 224,000 health or 140 health per model. For armor, it has a decent amount at 55, with 30 coming from its shield. It has an average armor rating and a range block chance of 45%. In terms of morale, it's below average again at 46. Speed is okay at 41. Melee attack is pretty low at 21. While melee defense is surprisingly high for an axe unit at 27, with 7 coming from its shield. Then for damage, we have a 17 to 17 split with 5 bonus against shield, which is pretty standard for one-handed axe. And lastly, we have a charge bonus of 14, which in my opinion is a bit low for an axe infantry unit. For traits, we have Hide Scrub and Forest, resistant to heat, and once again, weak vigor. For stances, we just have Hold, but there is a Spire ability which will boost the unit's melee attack and defense by 2 points as long as we have an ally nearby with at least 60 morale, which is going to be pretty hard to find amongst the lower Egyptian unit roster, but your general should do the trick. Overall, the lower Egyptian Axe Conscripts are a serviceable unit, as the 33% larger unit size does make them stronger. Having a normal 45% range block chance shield and a high damage weapon in the axe shores up some of the weaknesses in terms of the low melee attack and weak vigor. But if I had to recommend one lower tier unit for the lower Egyptian native roster, then this unit would be it. Moving on, we have the lower Egyptian Swordsman conscript, which is basically a clone of the Axe conscript, except they're using a sword, with an even lower melee attack of just 19, but a higher melee defense of 33, with 7 from shield. The Swordsman conscript is a more defensive unit in nature, but if you compare them to their Axe counterpart, their offensive damage is just so much lower with 28 base and 7 armor piercing, without any bonus against shield, and a meager charge of just 12 points. It's probably best to just forego this apparent 6-point bonus in melee defense and opt instead for a more offensive approach, as after all, the best defense is a good offense, as a dead enemy can't hurt you. Then for our last tier 2 unit, we have the Lower Egyptian Archers, which is going to be one of the better lower tier archer units in the game. And the reason behind this has nothing to do with melee stats, as those are terrible, with 110 health per model or 13,200 health across 120 units. The armor quality is surprisingly high at good, but the total armor is just 20 points, which makes the rating pointless. Morale is low at 36, speed is good at 42, melee attack and defense are horrendous at 11 points for both. Melee damage will match that of the Swordsmen with 28 base and 7 armor piercing. And finally, the charge bonus is gonna be low at just 10 points. Traits are also bad, as we still have weak vigor, in addition to hide in scrub and forest, and resistant to heat. Stance is just hold, but the range stats are pretty normal, with 19 ammo, the standard 150 range for a bow unit, base missile damage of 23 and 6 armor piercing. Accuracy, once again, it's 1 point lower in nigh versus typical 10, but reload time is pretty normal at 6.3 seconds. This means the lower Egyptian archers have basically a 33% more range damage increase compared to other similar tiered archer units, because head count actually matters here, as they directly translate to more arrows per volley. And aside from the one less point in base accuracy, this unit basically have the expected range stats for other similar level archers. So comparatively speaking, if you were going to recruit a lower tier archers across the board, the lower Egyptian archers are going to be your best choice. However, you might not want to ever recruit lower tier archers, since their range is at the bare minimum, and you don't get flaming shot with these lower tier units. Now, moving up to tier 3, we are finally going to start to get units that shine in the lower Egyptian roster, as now we're going to get a few units that have the larger unit size, but no weak vigor trait to hold them back. And we kick things off with the lower Egyptian veteran Spearmen, which has the 160 unit count, a total health of 24,000 or 150 health per unit. Aside from this numerical advantage in bodies, everything else is going to be a bit below average, as we're going to have 80 armor with 30 from shield, of good quality, range block chance of 45%, morale of 51, speed of 37. Melee attack is only 25, which is okay since this is going to be your defensive frontline unit, but their melee defense is sadly also kind of low at 32 with 7 from their shield. Across the board, the stats are going to be roughly 4 to 5 points below the standard stat average for a comparable unit. Melee damage is going to be on par though, as all spear of this tier will deal 31 base and 6 armor piercing damage with a 22 bonus against large. Lastly, their charge bonus is pretty much non-existent at just 9 points. For traits, we have hide in forest, and for stances, we have spear wall, which will help bump our range block chance to 70% and give us a charge reflect as well. So pretty basic over there, but notably we're missing the weak vigor, which is a huge plus. Overall, the lower Egyptian veteran spearmen will get the job done with sheer numbers, and this is especially the case when you compare them with the upper Egyptian counterpart at tier 3, because their tier 3 spearmen has a reduced unit size going from 120 standard to just 90. So instead of just having a 33% unit count advantage against the standard unit size of most normal native unit rosters, the lower Egyptian veteran spearman actually has a 77% unit advantage against their upper Egyptian counterpart at this tier, which easily makes them the better choice despite their slightly lower stats across the board, because you almost have double their numbers. Then moving on, we have the lower Egyptian veteran swordsman, which is the sword version of the previous unit, with almost identical stats except for a lower melee attack and defense stats, 2 points reduction for each, a different damage profile of 32 base and 8 armor piercing, which is slightly higher for both of these numbers compared to the spear, but you lose the bonus against large, and a higher charge bonus of 16. The swordsmen share pretty much the same exact strength and weakness as its spear counterpart. You get more of these guys, but they average about 4 to 5 points lower across the board for most of their stats. So if you were to compare them to their upper Egyptian counterpart, then they're much better because of that same 77% unit count difference, but compared to everyone else, it's just a 33% numbers advantage, which sort of balance out all the negatives, making them kind of even with everyone else. Now moving on to the range units for this tier, we start with the armored lower Egyptian archers, which is not a composite bow user, which is usually the case with higher tier archers. Instead, we get a slightly improved bow unit with a 120 unit or a 33% increase in unit size, A total health of 14,400 or 120 health per unit, 45 armor of the good quality, morale 46, speed of 37. They're not really combat capable despite the name armored, as they just have 16 melee attack and 13 melee defense and a weapon damage of 32 and 8, which translates to the same sword being used by the veteran swordsman. They have a respectable charge bonus of 14, but when we focus on their range stat, they are pretty disappointing, starting with 20 ammo and only 160 range. That's the big issue. We are still just a standard bow user. Sure, we have 10 more range than with the standard 150, but 10 range is hard to translate on the actual battlefield. It's so close that you really can't outshoot the 150 range user. Your unit will most likely walk up a little and you can basically exchange fire. So there's really no range advantage here. And their missile damage isn't that great either, with 27 base and 7 armor piercing. Accuracy is just 10 points. They do shoot faster at 5.9 seconds per reload. And they do get Flaming Shot, which is the one huge saving grace, as you will lose 5 base damage and 3 armor piercing damage, along with the 20 point of range. But sadly, because their bow shoots so fast already, the Flaming Shot actually will lose reload time for them, which is not usually the case for composite bow or long bows. And at the end of the day, you're picking these units, like for all lower Egyptian units, for their sheer numbers or mass. And in the case of range unit, you are raising your overall damage potential by 33%. So if you're shooting into infantry, especially in minor settlement sieges, you will end up doing more damage, which is one saving grace for these units, and you get flaming shot on them, which makes them much more usable. Now, the last tier 3 units we're going to have is going to be our lower Egyptian light chariot, which also sees a size bump, as the typical chariot have 28 units. Here we have 36, so it's not a 33% increase, it's closer to a 28% increase. In the case of a bow chariot, you are going to do more range damage. But this is also a double-edged sword for chariots, because while you do more damage from your range aspects, you're also going to run into more collision issues, congestion issues on the battlefield, which plagues the game in its current state. And this could potentially ruin your kiting capabilities and also severely weaken your chariot's overall performance should they get tangled up in melee, as they don't do very well in melee. Now, returning to the stats to confirm this, we will see that our 36 unit count with a total health of 14,760 or 410 health per model, it's actually not that high for chariot units, as I believe there are light chariots with 520 health. So for once, the health is not really on par. Their armor is also pretty light at 35, even though the quality is good. They have a morale of just 50 points, a speed of 120, which is great, but also standard amongst light chariot. Melee attack is only 20, defense is even worse at 16. Their melee damage has a 26 to 15 split, with majority of their melee damage coming from their charge bonus of 48. For range stats, they have 63 ammo, which is very high. The range of 160 is similar to the armor lower Egyptian archers we just saw, and they have the same damage output, 27 to 7. Accuracy is okay at 19, when most chariots starts at 20, but reload time is very fast at 4.8 seconds. For traits, they just have the basic ones with fire while moving and mounted sharpshooting to allow for 360 degrees moving, shooting. And for stances, they just have hold, which is pretty useless for chariots. Overall, if you're fighting on a wide open battlefield, such as a desert, the increased number and high ammo count of the lower Egyptian light chariot is a huge blessing, but they're not going to be very versatile when the terrain's more complex or when we're fighting siege battles. And typically in these cases, I tend to shy away from these type of units that are more restricted by terrain. Finally, as we move on to tier 4, we have our last lower Egyptian unit in the lower Egyptian chariot. And here is where the lower Egyptian native unit roster really falls apart for me, as this unit is an exact clone of the upper Egyptian chariot unit. They have identical stats for everything, except the lower Egyptian variant costs 3 less food for upkeep, which is nothing. And this basically means you should never build the native recruitment building chain inside your province capitals for the lower Egyptian units because it's not worth a slot. And this is the only tier 4 unit you can get from this native unit roster. And you can get this same exact unit from the upper Egyptian roster, which is your neighbor to the south. And they offer other very competitive Mace Axe units in tier 4. So definitely just build it in the upper Egyptian roster. It's the same exact unit. And if you're curious about how I exactly rated this unit, feel free to visit our upper Egyptian native unit guide. But in short, I thought this chariot was sort of middle of the road, average with no real strength or weakness. And I still feel the same here with this clone. So to summarize, of the 11 unit in the lower Egyptian native unit roster, I would recommend the tier 3 infantry units in the lower Egyptian veteran spearmen, the lower Egyptian veteran swordsmen, and the armor lower Egyptian archers, as these units have a decent unit count advantage without too many drawbacks such as weak vigor. Then for the situational recruits, I have the lower Egyptian archers, which is probably the best low tier archer in the game due to their extra unit. The lower Egyptian light chariot, which is good, assuming they don't run into terrain issues. And the lower Egyptian axe conscript, which is a decent fodder unit with more unit count and a decent damage from their axes. For the never recruits, we have the lower Egyptian militia, the lower Egyptian spearmen militia, the lower Egyptian militia slingers, the upper Egyptian swordsman conscript, and finally, the lower Egyptian chariot. The first 4 units here are all because they have weak vigor, low stats, and you can't really translate their extra unit count into damage. For the lower Egyptian chariot, they're the only tier 4 unit in this roster, and they're identical copy of the upper Egyptian chariot. So just recruit them from the upper Egyptian building and never commit one of your province capital building slots to the native unit recruitment. You can build it in any of the minor regions, save you a very key building slot. And because you'll never build that building, you'll never recruit this unit here. Just go get the upper Egyptian variant, which is why this unit is in never recruit. Not because the unit itself is bad, just never get the lower Egyptian one. And that brings an end to this guide on lower Egyptian native unit. Hopefully you have enjoyed it enough to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more guides like these in the future. Our next guide will actually be in 2 days, as I want to speed up my coverage of all the Total War Pharaoh units. So definitely stay tuned to the Western Desert or Libu unit roster guide this Friday. And until then, bye!